My leg's asleep.
Hello, Dragonfly Swarm. Yae Miko has finally returned for her first rerun, and a lot has changed since her first banner back in 2.5. Like, a lot. The entire basis that Miko once held onto was that she was an off-field and quick swap DPS that generally did not perform above average in the meta, and even then, players argued against that. But now, with access to powerful Dendro characters, unique new gear, and fun new strategies, Yae Miko feels like quite a different character than she once was, and is thriving in the current meta. So naturally, this video will discuss everything you need to know about Yae Miko in 3.2, from her kit to her constellations, her best artifacts, weapons, and the exciting teams she works with since Sumeru came out. And before we dive into Yae Miko's kit, I have a word from today's sponsor, Higan Eruthyll, an RPG strategy card game that has taken flashy gameplay to honestly an entirely new level. But it isn't even some regular 2D card game. It's a 3D real-time strategy battle experience with super fun characters who take to the field with their own unique abilities, and it's up to you to create a powerful team that can conquer Fantasyland. And speaking of, the character designs in Higan Eruthyll are absolutely amazing, and it feels like everyone has their own lovable and distinct personality alongside their abilities and what they bring to the battlefield. Oh my god, and the voice actors, it is so hard to choose my favorite characters when they're all so well fleshed out and unique. And that's part of the main idea of the game, plus devising strategies for each battle is vital to winning, and you'll have to get to know your teams and the enemies in order to play at your fullest potential. For example, some enemies are protected by minions that you gotta wipe through, and you also get to utilize the bullet time mechanic to precisely choose when and where your abilities will land in the battle. So being able to pick from a large pool of amazing characters has made the gameplay experience very fun for me. And personally, my current favorite is Euphoria for her great versatility, and her ultimate is so satisfying when played correctly in her strategy. Being able to smash down on a pile of enemies with her sword is just mwah, chef's kiss. But there are so many other super fun and skill expressive characters in Higan, and if you want to check them out yourself, you should click the link in my description to pre-register, because once Higan has 1 million pre-registers, they'll be giving out one of the rare and powerful 3-star characters to you and other players for free. It is such a steal because they're all so fun and the game has so many different enjoyable elements that you're gonna love. So again, click the link in the description to pre-register, and I will see you in Higan Eruthyll. Alright, let's jump right in with a quick recap of Yae Miko's abilities because there are some important new interactions with Dendro. To start, Yae Miko's attack talent allows her to perform a slow 3-hit combo in front of her, which previously wasn't all that great to use at all, but thanks to Aggravate, it is a bit less situational nowadays. However, her charged attack still isn't something you'll want to use too terribly often, aside from weaving it in between your attack combos occasionally. Those attack combos being 2 normal attacks into a charged attack and then a jump cancel, or rather, that's the best combo that incorporates her charged attacks, if you want to optimize that source of damage. Doing so will allow Yae to output more reactions such as Aggravate, because her charged attacks do not share the same ICD as her normal attacks. However, the majority of Miko's damage output will come from her elemental skill, which is her infamous Sakura turrets. Yae Miko has 3 charges of this skill that refresh every 4 seconds, and each turret lasts for 14 seconds when placed. When one or multiple turret is on the field, it will periodically zap nearby enemies for electro damage, and yes, the strikes from these turrets are actually considered AoE damage. In order to level up these turrets to 2 and 3 for the maximum turret damage, you must have 2 or 3 turrets within proximity of one another. Do note that when dashing to place her turrets, Yae Miko is not invulnerable like you are when you perform a normal dash, so she is susceptible to damage and interruption. Now, these turrets are already quite strong on their own, but thanks to multiple other important factors, they can become significantly stronger. Firstly, Yae Miko's 4th Ascension passive grants her a turret damage bonus based on her elemental mastery, and the reason that's so important nowadays is because she actually now has a very good reason to use elemental mastery thanks to Dendro reactions. Prior to Sumeru's release, there was no real reason to go out of your way and build EM on Yae, but that's changed, and beyond that, there are now quite a few powerful EM buffers in the game that can help her do this for maximum turret damage and aggravate damage. And finally, Yae Miko's burst is another massive source of damage in her kit that you shouldn't neglect. When casting her burst, Miko will strike thunder down in front of her, and then after a short delay, she can summon up to 3 more thunder strikes based on how many turrets she had active when casting the burst. This ability will consume all of the turrets she placed onto the field, but thanks to her 1st Ascension passive, it will also reset the cooldown of all of her turrets, so you can just replace them. It's important to note that none of the 4 thunder strikes on Miko's burst have any ICD, meaning they can all proc aggravate and other reactions, but aggravate is the most valuable to Yae, obviously. So in general, you can expect Miko to thrive in Dendro teams where her abilities can trigger lots of aggravate reactions, as well as occasionally hyper bloom, I suppose. She has quite good electro application, and because of this and her EM scaling, she's seen some major enhancements in her overall damage ceiling, as well as her playstyle versatility. And on that note, with talent priority, you're gonna almost always always want to prioritize her skill first, then her burst, and finally her normal attacks, if you choose to use them. Otherwise you can ignore the talent because she's still strong as an off-fielder.
Okay.
Moving on to Constellations, I don't want to talk too long about them since they're genuinely almost entirely based around increasing Miko's personal damage and nothing more, but I'll briefly discuss each one and the general value of them all. C1 is actually extremely nice for mitigating Miko's serious energy issues because it is going to grant her 8 energy back for every turret thunderbolt she summons during her burst. So in that way, she can restore a maximum of 24 energy, which is almost a third of her entire burst cost, so that's quite nice. And in my educated opinion, it's one of the only constellations I would actually recommend to anyone that can afford and enjoy it, because it's a good quality of life upgrade when building her. C2 is going to allow Yae's turrets to start at level 2 and reach level 4 instead of level 3 for even more damage, plus they have a huge range increase, so it's quite a nice damage spike, but isn't required for Miko to feel functional. C3 adds 3 levels to Miko's elemental skill talent, which is basically just more turret damage, so again, big damage spike, but not required. C4 actually allows Miko to buff her teammates, which is kind of interesting since that's the only utility she's able to provide to her teams, but even then, a 20% electro damage bonus for 5 copies of Miko is, as you might imagine, unnecessary. C5 adds 3 levels to Miko's burst, so yet again another large damage spike, especially if you're able to burst every rotation, but that's all this will provide. And finally, at C6, Miko's turrets will now ignore 60% of their opponent's defense, so much like Raiden's C2, this is an absolutely massive damage spike. If that's what you want, swag. Otherwise, the only constellation I would realistically recommend for those that want constellations is C1. And perhaps C2, considering the range increase can be a situational quality of life improvement as well. But again, I do want to stress that Miko is fully functional even at C0. The only issue you might run into is consistently funding her burst in certain team comps, because that thing is expensive. Anyways, moving on to the juicy part of this guide, a topic of discussion that I've seen so many people go back and forth about is what exactly are Yae Miko's best artifact sets nowadays? Because it used to be that you would just run 4-piece emblem if she wasn't paired with Raiden, which was rare anyways because people who played Miko typically only played her with Raiden, in which case you would just use boring old 2-piece combinations. But that's all changed because Miko has poetically branched out and now relies significantly less on Raiden than she once did, leaving her with quite a few options for artifact sets depending on the scenarios. So I want to start by clarifying that in any team where Miko is struggling with energy, you can simply fall back and use a 4-piece emblem set. It's going to provide a lot of value and it will ease the issues of her burst cost. You'll just have to be sure to capitalize on that and burst as often as you can for the maximum value. Do note though that if your Miko doesn't have energy issues, for example if she has C1 or if she's paired with a strong energy battery teammate, 4-piece emblem will lose a lot of value on her. However, thanks to several team synergies that you're gonna see popularly used with Miko, her mathematical best in slot artifact set is actually 4-piece Gilded Dreams now. With the math I'm slapping on the screen, I've compared a few different scenarios with 3 of Miko's strongest 4-piece sets, and as you can see, in all of these scenarios, 4-piece Gilded Dreams in a team with one other Electro unit pulls quite far ahead of her other options, even a 4-piece Thunder Soother with 100% uptime, which isn't even realistic. It's important to note that these numbers are just simple maths, so there will be differences in your actual gameplay versus these equations, but the general idea is that in most scenarios with Dendro teams, the importance of elemental mastery on Miko overshadows the value of other set bonuses she can benefit from. Basically, the more reactions she's causing, the more superior Gilded Dreams becomes. However, as you can see, 4-piece Thunder Soother is also a valid option in Dendro teams and can be relatively competitive with Gilded Dreams if you can maintain the 4-piece passive. The issue with that though is that if you're pairing Miko with Nahida, it will be very difficult to consistently maintain the Thunder Soother damage bonus because of how fast Nahida burns through Electro auras. Thus, I wouldn't really recommend Thunder Soother if you're planning on pairing these two together. A 4-piece Thundering Fury can also be good in Dendro teams, but it will not be competitive with 4-piece Gilded Dreams in most scenarios, and I would only recommend using this set if you already have a good one in your inventory. Otherwise, I would just save your resin. And finally, as I briefly alluded to earlier, Miko still works very well with any combination of 2-piece Thundering Fury, 2-piece Attack, 2-piece Elemental Mastery, or 2-piece Emblem, and if the stats are good enough, these 2-piece combos can be very good on Miko. But as for Yae Miko's artifact stats, not too much has changed actually. Your overall best main stat spread will still be an Attack Sands or ER Sands if you really need it, an Electro Goblet, and a Crit Circlet in order to maintain a 1-to-2 crit ratio. I say Attack Sands because if you're running Miko with good external Elemental Mastery bonuses and /or Gilded Dreams, she's actually going to be losing DPS by sacrificing her Sands for more EM. Therefore, attack will typically still pull ahead. But if you're running Miko in a Hyper Bloom team, you can actually get away with running an EM Sands instead of an Attack Sands, but only because in exchange for some of her personal damage, she's gaining a considerable boost to her Hyper Bloom damage, which will typically even out her damage output. And finally, if you want 3.2, you can technically run triple elemental mastery main stats, but only for the purposes of pure hyper bloom damage, and even then, if you're gonna do that kind of build, I would highly recommend doing it on Raiden or Shinobu instead. As for substats, obviously as usual, your first priority should be to fulfill Miko's energy requirements. If you plan on pairing Miko with another Electro unit, her energy requirement can be roughly as low as 130 to 140%, but as a solo Electro unit and when you want to burst every rotation, you could be looking at upwards of 200% energy recharge. These numbers can be a bit higher or lower depending on the scenario, but in most Dendro teams, Miko shouldn't have terrible energy issues. So after you've filled out your energy needs, you'll then want to prioritize crit substats to further enhance her ratio, then attack percent and EM substats are both very enjoyable, and after that, HP and defense are useless. So, moving onwards to Yae Miko's best weapons, funny enough, not a whole lot has changed regarding her best weapons, but we do have new catalyst options that have been released since her original banner, so I'll briefly discuss the best options in relatively soft order. And the first thing to note is that Miko is a DPS catalyst user, so she has the luxury of a large range of powerful weapons to choose from. Firstly, Kagura's Verity is her best in slot and her signature weapon. This weapon was literally designed for Yae, so the passive is very easy for her to capitalize on, and as with most crit-based weapons, she very much enjoys the large crit damage and the high base attack that the weapon provides. But you can also very comfortably get away with using a weapon like Skyward Atlas, which provides her with a large attack bonus and a nice passive for her personal damage. Lost Prayer can also be a good option, although you'll have to keep Miko on the field for a bit longer than usual to get good use out of the weapon passive. And finally, for 5 stars, Nahida's signature weapon as well as Memory of Dust can situationally be very good, but they're not generally going to perform quite as powerfully as my aforementioned recommendations. Nahida's signature catalyst does provide a lot of EM for Miko, which is nice, but it suffers from a relatively low base attack and requires Miko to make the most of the EM with lots of reaction damage, otherwise it will lose a lot of value. And then Memory of Dust is, well, Memory of Dust. It's okay if it's your only expensive option, but there are better weapons out there. More accessible options such as Oathsworn Eye can be very good if you have it, because this weapon comfortably covers Miko's energy needs and still yet provides her a nice damage bonus. But also your typical 4-star catalysts such as the Widzith and Solar Pearl can also be very powerful in most situations. Solar Pearl especially is more applicable than ever since Miko can comfortably play as an on-fielder nowadays. And finally, for free options, your best bet is to run either Hakushin Ring or Mappa Mare. But both of these catalysts are oriented around on-field playstyles, so you'll find the most value when playing Miko as the on-field driver for Aggravate or Hyperbloom teams. Otherwise, these weapons will be difficult for Miko to comfortably wield. Finally, as an honorable mention, because Favonius weapons are sexy and amazing, you can use Favonius Codex on Miko if you're okay with sacrificing her own DPS for the sake of her teammates and their energy costs. In some scenarios, this can actually be quite a good strategy to increase your team DPS, but overall, I recommend just leaning into Miko's own personal damage as a priority. Alrighty, and last but not least, it's time to go over all of Miko's best new teams with these amazing new builds. Nowadays, as I mentioned earlier, Yae has the luxury of fitting into a lot of different and new teams, all of which currently being under the Dendro meta. Her ability to drive lots of powerful reactions is invaluable to these teams, and further than that, she's no longer restricted to a selfish quick swap or off-fielder playstyle, because so many new teammates and synergies have made her a more practical and versatile character in combat. With that all said, the first and likely most popular team archetype for Yae Miko in 3.2 is Aggravate teams. Aggravate teams are simply a team in which you utilize a Dendro and an Electro character to cause quicken on your enemies, which then allows you to aggravate your Electro damage and spread your Dendro damage for massively increased damage output overall. Yae Miko is a staple unit and a very powerful option for these teams because of how dramatically she benefits from Aggravate amp damage, as well as because of her good Electro application and because she scales with EM. In this team, Miko will first need to be paired with a Dendro unit, and this can literally be any of them. Tignari, Traveler, Kole, and Nahida are all functionally perfect in this team because you technically only need a little bit of Dendro application to maintain the quicken reaction. But obviously, characters like Dendro, Traveler, and especially Nahida will be wildly better for Miko since they can also provide lots of supportive utility. Nahida specifically is very powerful with Yae, and the two of them together create some of the most powerful variants of Aggravate teams in the game with their massive AoE and single target damage outputs. But after you've picked your Dendro unit, your last 2 slots can flex in any number of ways so long as the characters don't interfere with the quicken reaction. Some of the strongest characters you can choose for Yae Miko in mind include Fischl. Fischl is an absolutely amazing energy battery for Miko, which will allow her to burst every rotation since Yae can play as an on-fielder and catch Fischl's particles. Plus, Fischl herself will add yet another significant source of Aggravate damage. You could also slot other Electro characters for similar reasons, like Beto for more off-field AoE damage, Shinobu for healing, Kuching or Sino if you'd rather Miko play off the field, etc. But other options such as Animo characters also work really nicely, because shredding Electro resistance will allow Miko's personal and reaction damage to enjoy a very large increase. But do keep in mind that if your Dendro Dendro unit is Nahida, you're gonna have to apply a lot of Electro in order to swirl and shred it. Characters like Sucrose, Venti, and Kazuha are the most notable animal characters to fill this role since they also provide crowd control, and they can easily chain react their own aggravate and swirl damage. But other characters such as Heizo and Jean can work as well. Finally, if need be, you can use one of your last 2 flex spots for survivability support such as Zhongli, who will not only provide a very powerful shield for Miko and her team, but also shreds elemental resistance, which is really nice, especially for Dendro damage. In general, aggravate teams are extremely abstract because they're so easy to play, so you really can't go wrong with any team. You'll just have to keep in mind everyone's energy requirements and find a team that feels most comfortable for you when it comes to Yae Miko. One of the most popular aggravate teams you'll see is one with Yae Miko, Nahida, Fischl, and Kazuha or Zhongli, because they all work almost perfectly together to create an extremely high damage output whilst being very easy to rotate with on the field. And again, that's just one example of a multitude of possible team options. And so, the second and final team archetype Yae works amazing in nowadays is Hyperbloom teams. Hyperbloom teams are already quite notoriously one of the strongest teams in the game right now, especially since Nahida came out, but Yae Miko actually adds a rather unique element to the team. In Hyperbloom comps, Miko will usually want to play as an on-fielder so that her wide electro attacks can quickly touch Bloom Seeds, making her a pretty good driver for Hyperbloom damage. However, since her personal damage is such a center aspect of her kit, you don't want to neglect that, and therefore will not typically build her as a full elemental mastery character like you would with Raiden or Shinobu. This means you'll want Miko to also be contributing personal damage via her turrets and her burst, turning into a mix between Hyperbloom team and a Yae Miko carry team. And it actually works very well across multiple variants. You're going to need a Dendro unit such as Nahida or Dendro Traveler, and then a Hydro unit so that you can create Bloom Seeds for Miko to react with. Then your 4th teammate slot can be any very large number of characters that can slightly alter the team's playstyle case by case. But the general idea is to use Yae Miko as a driver for off-field abilities, allowing her to deal good Hyperbloom damage and amazing personal damage for an overall very high team damage output. You'll very likely see a team such as Yae Miko, Nahida, Xingqiu, and Zhongli together with this team archetype, because Xingqiu and Nahida work very well together from off the field to create lots of Bloom Seeds for Miko. And then Zhongli provides a lot of safety as well as shredding Dendro resistance to increase your Hyperbloom damage. It is a very strong variant of this team, but again, there are a lot of different ways to build this Hyperbloom team with Yae Miko in mind, because just like aggravate teams, Hyperbloom is not a very challenging team to work with and yet is very strong. And while I guess it's worth mentioning that Yae does still work in non-Dendro teams as well, I do want to be clear that she generally won't output as much DPS outside of Dendro teams, and a lot of her focus going forward will remain primarily on these archetypes. But again, and overall, Yae Miko has benefited significantly since her first banner. She used to get quite a bit of hate for being a difficult character to work with for not a lot of reward, and virtually all of that has changed. She's a comfortable unit in most Dendro teams, she provides insane damage output and a multitude of playstyles depending on how you want to go about using her, so it's safe to say she's been quite significantly indirectly buffed since her release 9 months ago. But that about does it for my updated Yae Miko guide. If these builds worked for you or you just liked the video, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.